Hi guys! So if you're a reader like me, which I presume most of you are, you just know that you love reading. It's an intrinsic understanding, and for me certainly it's not one that I really ponder or think about a lot. But I think it's sometimes good to think about reading in a more abstract sense, to think about what drives us to read, why we enjoy it, and why it's so important. So for this video I've chosen a few books, both fiction and non-fiction, that explore these ideas a little bit more deeply, about reading but also about books and libraries, bookshops and book ownership more generally. I think these books are particularly useful if you're in a bit of a reading rut, you're not enjoying it as much as you used to or that you usually do. I think these books will really reignite your passion for reading. Firstly, I've got Alan Bennett's The Uncommon Reader, which is a short fiction novella about the Queen who happens across a travelling library and decides to take out a book. And over time she becomes absolutely enthralled with reading and she begins to devour books, much to the dismay of those around her as she begins to fail in her daily duties as queen. This book is funny and really easy to read, and I think it hammers home a really important point about reading in general, because when she's reading, the queen ceases to be a superior to everyone around her and she becomes a true equal to her subject. I think the Queen is a great protagonist for a book like this because she, more than anyone else, has no real idea what it's like to be anyone other than herself, and books really teach her that. They teach her about humanity and human behaviour in a way that allows her to see what it's like to be an average person, because in her day-to-day life she's so protected from that. It seems like such an odd concept for a book, but it really works magnificently, and it's really funny as well, so I'd highly recommend it. Next is a very short essay by Philip Pullman called Imaginary Friends, which is taken from a book of essays called Demon Thoughts, which is released in November. It's about the power of stories and the good it does to a child's imagination. It's written in response to Richard Dawkins' ideas that children should not be read fairy tales because it teaches them superstition and untruths. Pullman rightly thinks that this is nonsense, and he argues very eloquently that the power of imagination that reading instills in children is of utmost importance. And Philip Pullman's writing is just gorgeous. He writes, even in non-fiction, with such lyricism and clarity, and I would really recommend all his writing. As a side note, I will be making probably a few videos over the next few weeks about his Dark Materials and The Book of Dust, because that's a release that I have been highly anticipating for a long time now, and I am so excited. Next is another short essay, this time The Gifts of Reading by Robert Macfarlane, and it's fairly self-explanatory. It's about the power that the gift of a book can have and the impact it has that makes it unique in the realm of gifts. I always find books quite difficult gifts to give because they're so personal and subjective, but I think it's one of the nicest things to receive a book that someone has chosen specifically for you. More than just books as good gifts, he talks about books as vessels for memory and connected to real-life experiences that he's had as a result of the books he's been given. It's just a lovely read, and I think it'll definitely make you want to go out and select a book for someone you care about, and probably hope that someone will choose a book to give to you. Then I have a collection of essays, George Orwell's Books versus Cigarettes, and this was a surprisingly funny read. I think I had expectations because the only two books I've read by George Orwell are 1984 and Animal Farm, which are both fairly bleak reads, but it turns out he has a pretty healthy sense of humour. One thing that is clearly not meant to be funny is that the fact that this book is published by Penguin as part of their Great Ideas collection, and he writes at the start, "There are library subscriptions, and there are also the books, chiefly Penguin's and other cheap editions, which one buys and then loses or throws away." I think this shows how far Penguin have come in expanding and improving their collections since he wrote this. This book covers several topics in the various essays, the first of which discussing the price differences between books and cigarettes and arguing that just because books are expensive is no good excuse not to read. He estimates that his annual expenditure on books is £25, and I know that inflation over the decades since he wrote this makes this amount a lot more, but it did make me a little bit envious to read. He also talks about the charms and deficiencies of second-hand bookshops, saying, "Books give off more and nastier dust than any other class of objects yet invented, and the top of a book is the place where every bluebottle prefers to die." He also talks about the practice of reviewing books, and he has plenty of sharp criticisms to make. Orwell also theorises on the more serious topic of freedom of the press and the impact this has on creative writers, and there was one passage in particular that I really liked, so I'll read out a little bit of it. He says, "The journalist is unfree and is conscious of unfreedom when he is forced to write lies or suppress what seems to him important news. the imaginative writer is unfree when he has to falsify his subjective feelings, which from his point of view are facts. There is no such thing as genuinely non-political literature, and least of all in an age like our own when fears, hatreds and loyalties of a directly political kind are near to the surface of everyone's consciousness. The last half of the book is taken up by a single essay which is less about books and more about the education system in England as experienced by him as a boy, and making criticisms of its corporal punishment and its entrenched class hierarchies. He does reference his reading in this essay, particularly Thackeray, and while it's not explicitly about books, it's still really worth reading, and the book as a whole is really interesting. Lastly is another fiction book, and I've chosen The Strange Library by Haruki Murakami. And I wish I had the physical edition to show you because it's such a beautiful book and it has gorgeous artwork throughout. If you're familiar with Murakami, then this won't be much of a surprise to you, but it's an incredibly weird and eccentric book where sometimes meaning is shrouded behind men in sheep costumes and disappearing girls. It really takes you down the rabbit hole into an alternative dimension, but it still has similarities with our own world, notably the fascination and obsession with knowledge that the protagonist feels, which drives him to go into a library seeking information about tax collection in the Ottoman Empire. It's a gorgeous read, and as with all Murakami's work, it's very open to interpretation, so it might not have as much explicitly to do with reading as some of the other books I've mentioned, but the one thing I will say is that the book itself is definitely worth a read. So those are all the books I've got to talk about today, but of course my list is by no means exhaustive because unsurprisingly there are a lot of people who've written books and short stories and essays about reading. So if there are any others that you particularly like, I'd really love to hear because I would really like to read them myself. Hopefully you found this video interesting, and I'll see you next time. Bye!